It's a real gift to welcome all of you here tonight with us as we celebrate. It's a real gift to welcome all of you here tonight together, and tonight as we are able to honor both our grass tops and in particular our grassroots. As you may be aware, we're working with international partners and we're in the process of launching campaigns for Jubilee 2025 in more than 160 countries. In just a few weeks on Christmas Eve in Rome, we will join Pope Francis, interfaith leaders, in order to open up the Jubilee door and kick off 5 years of campaigns for Jubilee 2025. Before we begin tonight, I'd like to invite everyone to stand up. And we're going to begin with, one of the very exciting things about the Jubilee 2025 kickoff is that we have so many social movements and groups that are joining us for the first time that have never joined us before. And we're getting to relive a lot of the great movement organizing that took place over our history. And a critical part of the next 5 years of campaigns will be music and art, because music and art is what lifts us, inspires us, and moves us. So two very good friends in the Jubilee movement, Wendell Berry, who is a mad anarchist poet and makes a lot of bourbon and wine in Kentucky, wrote a poem. And another friend of ours, a theologian, Chet Byers, put that poem to music. So I'm going to sing a line and I would invite you to repeat it after me. And so we begin a actual piece of music that was created by and for the Jubilee movement. And we start like this, so just repeat the line after me. And when I rise, let me rise up, like a bird, full of grace. And when I fall, let me fall down, like me, without regret. And when I rise, let me rise up, like a bird, full of grace. And when I fall, let me fall down, like a leaf, without regret. Amen. Welcome. So in a moment, I'm going to invite up for our opening prayer this evening, Rabbi Matt Cutler, who is one of the leaders of our New York coalition and a rabbi from Schenectady, New York, who is also our board co-chair, along with JubileeUSA from Muslims for Economic Justice, who you will meet later this evening as well. Before we begin, I just want to say how excited we are to have you all come as the leadership of your organizations from across the country, from Puerto Rico, the leadership of our founding members, the labor and religious community that have made this movement a strong and powerful movement. And tonight, we're very excited to honor and acknowledge one of our founders, Cardinal Turkson, who really represents grass tops leadership around the world in the Jubilee movement. And in particular, in addition to honoring Cardinal Turkson, we're excited to have a panel tonight where we are able to honor our grassroots leadership that continues to grow across the United States. Working with interfaith organizations over the past few months, we have launched campaigns, as I noted, in 160 countries around the world, more countries than have ever been activated before in the Jubilee movement. And we're incredibly excited, not only about that particular movement that's moving forward, but that both old partners and new partners are joining the fight and not looking at campaigns for 1 year, but looking at campaigns for 5 years around the world. Tonight, we're incredibly excited to be honoring our grassroots, from Jubilee Southern California to the powerful Jubilee New York Coalition to the Jubilee Ecumenical Coalition of Puerto Rico. And one of our biggest mobilizers, which we will count on a lot as we approach the G7 meetings in Canada, as we approach the G20 meetings that we're organizing towards in South Africa during the Jubilee year, and prepare for Jubilee 2026. As the United States hosts the G20 meetings, one of our biggest mobilizers historically is the labor movement. So we're so excited to also be joined by our labor leaders tonight and to be able to acknowledge the important work of the AFL-CIO, as well as other labor movements as we prepare for these momentous moments of decision. We'll hear from all of them tonight. In your program tonight, after hearing an opening prayer from Rabbi Matt Cutler, I will welcome Ruth Messenger, a previous awardee of the Jubilee Founders Award from our 20th anniversary, who is going to talk a little bit about Cardinal Turkson, the message that Cardinal Turkson is lifting tonight, as well as introduce him. On June 5th, Cardinal Turkson and I, at his academy, he is the Chancellor of the Academy of the Holy See of the Vatican Academy of Social Sciences. Cardinal Turkson hosted the Jubilee movement here, as well as the Jubilee movement around the world, and finance ministers to hear Pope Francis lay the theme for the Jubilee year. And on June 5th, we had a historic speech from Pope Francis and other interfaith leaders that essentially noted, for the focus of Jubilee 2025 and for 5 years of campaigns, number one, debt cancellation must be a major priority. And not only debt cancellation, Pope John Paul II lifted what other leaders, and John Paul II and Pope Benedict lifted, was that debt cancellation is not enough. We actually need new processes in the international financial architecture. We need an international bankruptcy process. And debt cancellation and international bankruptcy process, creative financing and aid must be moved forward now, Pope Francis calls, in order to end poverty and address the challenges that so many countries are facing on climate change. So it's incredibly exciting as we move forward with this campaign to have the words from the Holy Father and other interfaith religious leaders on the need for a growing and powerful Jubilee movement. I think perhaps one of the things that we are most excited about is the movement that is growing in the United States, and the reality as we have a new administration in the United States, that the issues of debt, poverty, economic aid, as well as bankruptcy, we expect to continue to move forward under the Trump administration with our organizing. And that's incredibly important and critical, given that a lot of the work we're doing on global economic aid, on debt relief and financing began during the first term of the administration. I know that many of us have a lot of questions, and so do we, about moving forward, but we know that the work on debt, on poverty and economic aid is work that, with our hands joined, we can continue to do. We've been organizing with our partners in South Africa, as well as for the past 3 years, preparing for Jubilee 2025 with all interfaith organizations across Africa, for South Africa to host the G20 next year. And we've been organizing with our partners in Canada to support the pilgrimages that are starting to take place around the world for the G7 meetings. That'll take place in June outside of Calgary. What we're incredibly excited about in terms of those particular meetings is that we, with our Canadian partners, and I know we'll hear more tonight from some of the groups that are organizing pilgrimages to Calgary and to South Africa. I think what we are incredibly excited about is our Canadian partners have talked about creating a human chain from Calgary all the way up to the Rocky Mountains and Kananaskis, where we're organizing with every religious group across Canada, as well as the Indigenous communities across the nation. And so tonight, as we get to hear from Cardinal Turkson, as we have a brief panel to reflect on some of the goals of our growing movement, we're incredibly excited that tonight the focus is on Jubilee 2025, a pilgrimage to honor God and poverty and heal our planet. I would like to welcome one of our board co-chairs, Rabbi Matt Cutler, up to offer the opening prayer tonight and say a few words.
Thank you. First of all, we all need to be very grateful, not only for our hard work and dedication that JubileeUSA does, but we really need to applaud the staff, in particular Eric, for the selfless devotion that he has given this over the years. So please join me. So the quote here from Leviticus is a reminder of the mission that is out there. But tonight we look inward. We look inward for the energy and the strength. And I want us to focus in on the patriarch Jacob, who in this week's Torah portion is wrestling with a presence. And the rabbinic commentators have a field day. Is this a man? Was this an angel? Was it Esau? Was it himself? Indeed, this is a very important understanding for us as a group to look at what we are. You see, if it's a man, an Ish, or Esau, it's an entity out there. We are wrestling with policy that affects lives. We are wrestling with individuals who can make people rise up to reach their fuller divine potential. And if we're wrestling within ourselves, we're taking a look at those flaws in our human self: greed, self-centeredness, myopic behavior, bigotry, anti-Semitism, anti-Muslim Islamophobia, whatever hate groups are out there that says this is mine and mine alone, whether it's based on color or economic position or location in the world. We are finding the ability to rise up. The Maggid of Gosnitz, Israel Hofstein, who lived in the 19th century, talks about what's being wrestled here is the sense of self. And when Jacob walks away, he limps with humility. Humility isn't a bad thing. Humility is not humiliation. Humility is to be in balance, where you're taking your presence and understanding your place and not assuming more than your space. So we offer this prayer. Kor Chaim, O source of life, give us the courage to understand our own abilities. Give us the courage not to waver from the vision that has been mapped out before us. Do not let us delay in caring and hearing the needs of those who are most dependent on the policies that are going to be effective. We have done solid work, but there's a lot more work to be done. Therefore, we ask God to give us strength and confidence. This also. Amen. Amen. Now, I have one last thing to do up here, and I get the honor of highlighting the work of one of our individual staff members who, technically is leaving or already has left. But she's back because she cares so much about our work. Jubilee Woodhead, come on up. Right here, all the work that we do is a reflection of a very small staff. And when we, a group of us, went to Belgium to be part of Eurodad and to meet with our partners in debt relief work, they were shocked to know that our staff is 3 paid employees because of the hard work that is being done and the incredible amount of time and energy. Angeline, your warmth, your humor, your keen eye for detail, and your ability to grab us by the hand and say, come share this with me, makes things so special. So, did you actually have to print out your own certificate? Yes, you did. Nice move, Eric. And now, here comes something that you didn't expect. Eric, Aldo, let me invite you up here. Sophia, Reverend Caleb Lyons, would you join me up here? We're getting the privilege now to say thank you the way that a religious organization should. We are going to bless you. And I'm going to, here he comes, as Aldo and Eric place hands on your shoulders. No, it's not an execution, it's a blessing. We are going to say these words from the Bible. In Hebrew, it's Yivarecha Adonai v'yishmerecha.
May God bless you and keep you.
Ya'er Adonai panav elecha v'kuneka.
May God's face shine upon you and be gracious unto you.
Yisa Adonai panav elecha v'yasem lecha shalom.
And may God give you peace.
Wherever you go, whatever you do, know that we are grateful. The work that you have given, the heart you have given us, and the ability to sustain us. We thank you, we applaud you, and we admire you. Thank you. Wait a minute, we're gonna do a picture. Thank you.
Now it's my honor to introduce Ruth Messenger, who is one of those people that needs no introduction. And Ruth came down, all the way from New York just to be with us. Right after the event, she'll get back on a train to go back home. Ruth Messenger is not only a former assembly member and leader and New York City Council member of New York State. She is the ambassador for American Jewish World Service. And when she took over American Jewish World Service opened up their Washington, D.C. offices for the Jubilee 2000 campaign. Ruth has been absolutely selfish and stalwart, and I'm going to tell a story about Ruth. Several years ago when we started our work against vulture funds, really JubileeUSA kind of coined that particular term. Ruth was working with us to stop legislation at that point in New York State, where we had mobilized over 4,000 people across New York State in 2012. In the dead of night, vulture funds were trying to pass legislation that would have allowed them to continue to litigate even after losing. So even defying our legal process in the United States. Because Ruth knew personally the head of the assembly and the head of the Senate, she made some very important phone calls that helped stop that negative, terrible, horrific legislation. So Ruth got a lot of pushback from donors and others who asked to have meetings with her. And I don't think this story is public until tonight, but they asked to have a meeting with Ruth to tell her how she was wrong and that she shouldn't have stopped this legislation. It's going to hurt her fundraising. Ruth welcomed them into her office And then she politely said, "Thanks for sharing." You're wrong. And Ruth, with a backbone of steel, has been one of the great leaders of our New York campaign, as well as mobilizing people across the country. So Ruth tonight, as a former award winner of our 20th anniversary for her work in Jubilee, is going to offer a few introductory remarks and introduce Cardinal Turkson. Ruth Messenger.
So I start by echoing the rabbi's comments that this is all about Eric and everything else is like a window dressing. So Eric describes these moments to you, but these moments happen because Eric shows up on the phone or in your office and says, whatever. And in my case, it was like, I know you're doing human rights and anti-poverty work on behalf of the American Jewish community in some 20 countries around the world. Do you know about debt? Yeah. And he said, no, you don't actually know about debt. Then you get a full lesson from beginning to end. And then it turns out that you spend the rest of your life meeting with legislators. To be fair, all of you have state legislators. They have lots of things on their agenda, from garbage to traffic to rent increases. And you try to explain to them about heavily impacted poor countries and how they're being asked by indeed vulture capitalists to pass legislation that is only in the self-interest of the vulture capitalists and that is damaging to countries and to people around the world. So I thank Eric, as I think all of you do, for that level of introduction. But I'm really here tonight to say that those efforts will continue when I'm on the panel before I go back out in the rain to the station. When I'm on the panel, I'll talk a little bit more about the work in New York, but it has continued very much as Jubilee USA wants it to. That is, we keep pushing to stop bad legislation and to encourage good legislation. But it involves, in addition to all of the legislative efforts that you might be aware of, it really involves educating very knowledgeable elected officials about a universe of the world that they don't know anything about. And I think that's part of why honoring Cardinal Turkson is so important, because he represents, as you all know, a vast community of believers and a faith leader whose words are literally heard by every single human being in the world. Not just the response of the faithful in the Catholic Church, but when the Pope speaks, people listen. And when the Pope speaks on these issues, he's drawing attention to issues that are just not on the consciousness of a lot of people. And it's work of people like Cardinal Turkson that put all of these pieces together. So I, of course, Cardinal, Your Eminence, am not privileged to which words you wrote, but we're going to give you credit for virtually everything in all of the encyclicals. But what I want to say particularly is that I know you all know this, so I'm going to be brief. But he's a cardinal who grew up in the church in Africa, in Ghana, knowledgeable in ways that to be hugely respectful. I'm going to say excluding the people in this room, but knowledgeable about the life issues, the governance issues, the financial issues, the ecological issues of a universe of countries that are just not on the horizon of most Americans. And to the extent that they are, and even people who are quite concerned and are engaged in our various movements about helping this country or helping on that issue or dealing, don't understand the interconnection here, which, to be blunt, this is the essence of Jubilee, is that problems that we, the broader Western community, are working to solve. And I think we are working to solve them, but at the same time, we're creating them and we're fostering them and we're making it impossible for countries to escape the debt burdens that would allow them, were they to escape those burdens, to go on and do the kinds of investment in their people and work on behalf of their people and on behalf of education and healthcare in their own countries that they want to do. And I'm gonna choose to read two things that I'm, as I said, convinced that come directly from the code. But the one that moved me the most, and these are in the words of the code. Because this one, I think, speaks to every single one of us, and we can relate it to the lowest issues and the most largest issues of our lives. It is not just any kind of financing that is useful to people, but one that implies a shared responsibility between those who receive it and those who provide it. The benefit such financing can bring to society depends on its conditions, on how it is used, and on the frameworks in which the debt crises that may arise are resolved. So for me, it's this broad question of responsibility. Who is responsible for what? I come from Rabbi Matt's tradition, and I'll quote not ancient text, but modern text. One of my heroes is a rabbi in the last 100 years, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. And Rabbi Heschel said, in a free society where terrible wrongs exist, some are guilty, but all are responsible. And that's what this is talking about. If you're going to have a debt relationship with, with your university, with your cousin who's loaning you some money, as a country, you have to think about what are the ethical frameworks of how that debt should proceed, or you're undermining the efforts that you're trying to build. So this is really a question of all of us becoming knowledgeable and taking responsibility. And I want to say that what I think Cardinal Turkson, on behalf of the Vatican, has done so eloquently is to take an issue which some of you have been engaged in, thanks to Eric, probably forever, but an issue that is about equity and justice, that talks about fair financing systems, that talks about social good, and added to it, as I think an African can perhaps do best, the fact that this all has huge agricultural, ecological, and climate ramifications as well. That the money that was loaned and the investments, in quotes, that were made very often were counter to the development interests of those countries. And so in making loans, not only did we end up saddling countries with debt that they couldn't handle, but we ended up undermining their own natural approaches to learning how to grow food, feed their families, and protect against climate change. And as you know, I think all of you, because I think you're a hugely knowledgeable population, but one of the consequences of this is that the world now has, I'm sure we all have different numbers, but something like 60 million climate refugees. So people who are refugees, not for all the many reasons that our ancestors and our country people and the people we know are refugees, but refugees because they can no longer live where they want to live because they can't grow enough food to feed themselves. And that is also involved in how do you help countries grow and develop in ways that do not undermine their futures. So I'm going to read you one other thing because it moved me immensely. And it's going to obviously take me 1 minute to find it, so you'll be very patient. In a much longer presentation about signs of hope, I was delighted to read from the pontiff that sign of hope had to do with an investment in migrants, because I have to tell you that that is the issue that I am totally consumed with now. I live in a city, New York, with 500,000 new New Yorkers who have great future potential for the city and the country, whose lives are being further damaged, the lack of attention and support that they're getting from city and state government. And so I was quite moved to read the sign of hope, some comments about migrants, but we're focused tonight here, so we are, on signs of hope having to do with the issues of debt. And so in the readings, thank you again for this eloquent perspective, it says very specifically, appeals for hope, echoing the age-old message of the prophets. The Jubilee reminds us that the goods of the earth are not destined for a privileged few, but for everyone. rich must be generous and not avert their eyes from the faces of their brothers and sisters in need. And it goes on to say that the way to do that is to make note of the coming Jubilee, that is these next 5 years, directed to the more affluent nations so that they acknowledge the gravity of so many of their past decisions and determined to forgive the debts of countries that will never be able to repay them. So Cardinal, I thank you for your commitment to these issues. Thank you even more on the work that you are already doing and the church is committed to do over these next 5 years to make the dream of, I think, all of us, but the super dream of Eric and of Jubilee USA a reality. Please come on. The description says Jubilee USA Network. For his global leadership, Jubilee USA Network presents the Jubilee Founders Award to His Eminence Cardinal Peter Caldwell Apiak Turkson.
Cardinal Turkson flew in just for this event. He's here about 30 hours in the country. To be able, we have hundreds of people online from around the world, but to kick off the campaigns. Cardinal Turkson, thank you. You believe that? Yes, no, 30 hours.
Whatever he says, you know, we have to believe.
And the
He's
reason,
our leader.
the reason we have legislation in the New York Senate is because of Ruth Messenger, who convened meetings in her living room in New York with legislators and me. I'd go up over the weekend and be with Ruth and her grandchildren running around, and we would have New York legislators come and sit on the couch where Ruth held school. And that's why we have Senate legislation. Cardinal Turkson. Thank you.
He wants me to read this.
No, but you want your computer. Well,
This is time to take your last sip of water. Or stretch your knees or stretch your legs. Whatever is about to happen. But I must express my gratitude to Eric and the board of the Jubilee campaign for this invitation. It came at a time that one could have said no, but again, at the time that one felt that we needed to respond and try to do a part. Because a week ago, by this time I was in Brazil, not a week ago. I was in Brazil, Rio de Janeiro and Brasilia, to talk about ecology and then racial inequality in Brasilia with the Supreme Court of Brazil to see what can be done. And this was in the context of South Africa, Brazil, and the United States, because they are in the impression that had been given that Brazil was very harmonious, racially. And they begin increasingly to discover that they live in with a falsehood. That is not really the case, so they figured that they had to do something about it. So in any case, I had said this to Eric, and he had suggested that I fly right away from Brazil here. But doing that would have had me miss the consistory in the Vatican, where the Pope decided to make new cardinals. And at that event, all of us are also supposed to be there to receive the new cardinals who have been made. So I necessarily had to go back to base and then come. But I'm certainly glad to have responded to the invitation to meet all of you. Several of you I've met before and probably not meeting for the first time. I'm glad to be in your company tonight. So recognizing again the diversity of the faiths and the groups that make up the Jubilee campaign, I'd like to suggest that my observation tonight be taken as just a contribution to a multi-religious, a group that approaches this issue from different angles. And the angle that I like to assume or take this evening is just from the particular angle that Ruth, talked about from the Vatican, from the church, and all of that. So again, with a little bit of temerity again, I recognizing, the presence of Rabbi and then Ruth and all of in this room. I'd like to start off by drawing attention to the Jubilee celebration itself. Everybody can read about it in the book of Leviticus, chapter 22, 25, most importantly, and even a little bit of it also in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 15. But I'd like to suggest that the concern of the Jubilee probably derives from some other celebrations in the Old Testament. All of us know about the Sabbath institution, which was aimed not only at regulating divine worship to God on the seventh day, but it also sought to maintain social order, liberation from slavery according to the book of Deuteronomy chapter 5, and concern for the poor. But according to the book of Leviticus 23, there was also a celebration of a 50th day after 7 complete Sabbaths, which was a feast of the new grain, as it were, a new harvest. And that became an occasion for an invitation to God's people in the Old Testament to not glean and harvest their crops to the edges, but leave fringes for the poor ones in the community to also come and feed on that. It goes on then, so this is another Sabbath celebration. The first one, not working, take a break. The second one, enjoying what God has enabled you to glean from the earth, but consider the poor who have nothing and allow them, the friends, to come and feed themselves with. Then there's also a feast of the 7 Sabbaths, which followed another 7 months. And within that was celebrated the famous, the great day of penance or repentance, the day of atonement, as if it was a celebration of self-restraint, self-affliction, as it were, and absence, therefore, of any sense of self-indulgence. And this comes right after they've celebrated the feast of the produce from the earth, the first grains. And right after that comes a feast, another Sabbath, which was meant to give rest to the land. So after 6 years of working the land, there was supposed to be the seventh year was supposed to give rest to the land. So do not work the land, so the land may have rest. And then finally, of course, will come chapter 25, the great Jubilee, with the sounding of the shofar, so that everybody would go back to liberation, everybody will go back to his home. So I like to recall this short, as if I go briefly through this short presentation of the Sabbath. Therefore, it appears as if the Sabbath institutions aimed not only at regulating divine worship, but also social order in the form of liberation from slavery, giving respite to the land, and then giving new lease of life to the indebted and the poor ones, who, as it were, started life and one or the other thing happened, so they had to sell themselves into slavery. When the Jubilee year came, they acquired their independence again, as it were, a new lease of life to begin all over again, as it were, with a new lease. So the blessings of these celebrations, as you all know, will flow into Jesus' own, preaching in the Nazareth, in the synagogue in Nazareth. And then, as it were, challenge all his followers to do one thing, to seek out ways in which God's revelation of the dignity and the destiny of all creation might become real, incarnate in human history and in the world. So the charge then of revealing the dignity and the destiny of all of creation and make it concrete and real is what we're looking at. So I like to look at, in this sense, flowing from this, share some considerations with you about the Jubilee lived as Christian charity, which may also be offered as a basis for our call for debt relief and debt cancellation, and then try to illustrate that with some examples in the current writings of the Pope and in our own world. So some of you may certainly, but probably not everyone, at the end of the Great Jubilee year 2000, as you may recall, Pope St. John Paul II wrote this: "The scenario of poverty can extend indefinitely if, in addition to its traditional forms, we think about new patterns. These latter often affect financially affluent sectors and groups which are nevertheless threatened by the despair at the lack of meaning in their lives, by drug addiction, by fear of abandonment in old age and in sickness, by marginalization or social discrimination. In this context, then, Christians must learn to make their act of faith in Christ by discerning his voice in the cry for help that rises from the world of poverty. This means carrying on the tradition of charity, which has expressed itself in so very many different ways in the past 2 millennia, but which today calls for even greater resourcefulness. And now is the time then for a new creativity in charity, new creativity in living out this love and concern for one another, not only by ensuring that help is effective and help gets to people, sometimes with a sense of humiliating them, but help gets to people in full recognition that they are ultimately brothers and sisters. This, according to John Paul II, is the vision of the church in the new millennium, to adopt creative forms of charity in such a way that it is not demeaning, it is not humiliating, but rather enables people to attain their dignity. And in 2015, Pope Francis also declared an extraordinary Jubilee year, but this time he called it the Jubilee Year of Mercy, through the papal bull Misericordia Vultus of 2015, which emphasizes the importance of mercy and the need to gaze on it. The bull also recalls the need for the church to be more open, keeping alive the spirit of the Second Vatican Council, as it were, throwing open the windows of the church to have the church see the reality of the world outside and have the world outside also see into the church. And seeing into the church, according to Pope John the 23rd, at the declaration of this of the council, was to establish a new form of engagement, a new reality of engagement between church and society. So the celebration of the all-encompassing love and mercy of God laid the basis for a program of inclusion and inclusivity in the church. The opening of the Jubilee Year door in Bangui, Central African Republic, a place where the only tarred road was from the airport to the presidential palace, and where everything else was dusty. That's where Pope Francis wanted to open the Jubilee doors, which he would do 24th of December in the Vatican. He decided in 2015 to go and open the Jubilee door in Bangui. Happened to have joined him. He leaves the new theater with clean cars up. At the end of the day, it's all dusty around the hand because everybody wanted to touch him, and he allowed himself to be touched and all of that. A lot of it happened on that day. But for him going out there to open the Jubilee doors was this expression of inclusivity, the belongingness of all people in the church, regardless of their poverty and regardless even of their indebtedness. All of them were members of the church. So these were two celebrations of the Jubilee year in recent history, and their core message of creativity in charity as a response to the scenario of poverty and the mercifulness of God, which excludes no one, grants a new lease of life to the abandoned, the oppressed, the discarded, and the indebted. And so in Caritas in Veritate, Pope Benedict XVI takes up this same message and idea again and makes this creativity in charity the task of everyone in society, presenting it as the principal driving force behind the authentic development of every person and of all humanity. Pope Benedict XVI goes on then to require that of every Christian in society. He says, the more we strive to secure a common good corresponding to the real needs of our neighbors, the more effectively we love them. And every Christian is called to practice this charity, this institutional political form of charity, in a manner corresponding to their vocation and according to the degree of their influence in society. I say this because it is like saying, if we were to consider such a statement true of all members of society, including the bankers, the business people and all, then it will become clear that all will recognize they have an obligation to respond to a call of charity that corresponds to their position in society. And this position in society then may be an investor, a banker, a real estate, or it could be anything. But whatever the position is, the Pope says that you have obligation to live a life of creative charity. And so the call, sometimes for relief of debt and cancellation of all of that, for me, probably more useful, rooted in this type of invitation and appeal. It becomes a form of charity, creative charity towards the neighbor, to even not want to throw him into indebtedness and anything of that kind. So this is a proposal then that I like to make tonight. And so when that is the case, if it's the obligation of all to practice charity that corresponds to their status and their role in society, then what is this reality and who does it apply to? And what are the areas then of the exercise of the charity? According to me, then every area of human life comes under this exercise of charity. It is all of human earthly activity. For as Pope Benedict goes on to say, it is only when man's earthly activity is inspired by this charity that it contributes to building the kingdom of heaven, which we aspire after and which we pray for every day. So, suggestion that I'm making this evening, this presentation is very simple. In an increasingly globalized society, the common good and the effort to obtain it cannot fail to assume the dimensions of the whole human family. And that is to say, the community of peoples and nations in such a way as to shape the earthly city in unity and in peace, rendering it somehow, as it were, closer to that which we pray for and I aspire after. So here is a call to a global and universal living or exercise of creative charity. A global call to a universal exercise of global charity or creativity in charity by all and in all of human activity and endeavor. And if this is the case in all human activity and endeavor, then there's no activity which is subtracted or which can subtract itself from this application of this. And so tonight I wish to suggest that, that this should, as a possible basis also for our conversation about debt relief and debt cancellation, that it's an act of the exercise of creative charity by everyone and on behalf of everyone to simply work towards canceling debt or granting debt relief and all of that. It is not only a work of justice, but it's also a work that derives from this invitation to be creative with our works of charity. So saying, it then goes on to also make the observation that making this a call to the exercise of charity also draws attention to the fact that the issue of debt relief and debt cancellation for any part of humanity is actually also an anthropological and a human issue. Because the indebted and the creditor are basically human beings. And we may not fail to see this reality. Behind a creditor and behind the indebted is a human being, is a human person. So essentially, then the conversation also assumes and takes an anthropological character, which needs to be looked at. At a conversation then that was held, I suppose, Eric made reference to it. Two of such conversations were held. The first one was held in 2020, when the COVID crisis broke. And then in the Vatican, we had to create a task force to deal with the COVID crisis. The task force that we created had to deal with this issue of helping the poor in the needy areas and their condition of impoverishment and indebtedness. So the panelists quickly portrayed the issue of indebtedness as a human dignity issue, as a justice issue, and as a peace issue. They sought accordingly to give a human face to an issue that is often discussed with figures, with statistics, and with graphs. These do have the great value of presenting palpably the enormity and the gravity of the situation. But they often also conceal the fact that behind those numbers and those graphs are concrete human beings. So there is a human face to indebtedness, and it is twofold. It is the human face of the creditor, the one who gives the loan or the capital, whether it's in the form of an IMF or a commercial shark or anybody. There is a human face of the creditor, governments and all, just as there is also a human face to the indebted, to the one who received the sum or the capital and suffers from its consequence. So putting a human face to the issue of debt and indebtedness and its management does not only invite us to humanize indebtedness, but it also invites and invokes solutions from our sense of humanity. So the solution to indebtedness sometimes also call on our sense of humanity, our being human beings, and the basic human values and qualities that we possess. It also evokes solutions such as our sense of love and goodness, from our sense of solidarity, compassion, subsidiarity, from our sense of the common good, and from the recognition that the goods of the earth belong to all, a principle sometimes referred to as the universal destination of the goods of the earth. So these are basic human qualities and human virtues which can also inspire the conversation about indebtedness, debt relief, or debt cancellation. So there can be a human form of argument for the debt cancellation, an appeal to basic human virtue and human qualities. So when the US Bishops Conference in 1986, some time ago, wrote their pastoral letter on Catholic social teaching and the US economy, they made this observation: economic justice for all raises important social and moral questions for each one of us and for society as a whole. Like family life, economic life is one of the chief areas where we live out our faith, love our neighbor, confront temptations, fulfill creative design, and achieve our holiness. And that is how the fundamental conditioning of the economic situation of a country impacts greatly the lives of its citizens. From this, Pope Francis goes on then to tag on this observation. So the unjust fiscal regimes and financial cultures which dominate the present life of the world's population is one of the inequalities, according to Pope Francis, which bedevil the living of a dignified life by a majority of the world's population. Finance, the Pope goes on to say, has not only been decoupled from the real economy, becoming an industry on its own. Financial engineering, in fact, very often breaks loose from the bridles of financial ethics, solidarity, participation, and the common good. And maximization of gains and returns become the only law that it hearkens to and listens. Against this background, then, what can we say? There is indeed a debt and development crisis in many countries in the Southern Hemisphere. The prevailing view that if a country does not default, there is not a debt crisis is wrong. Debt-distressed countries actually do default on economic and social development as they prioritize debt payment over critical public investment in education, in healthcare, the environment, and so on. And infrastructure jeopardizing the development and the well-being of their people. Current debt and economic policies in many debt-distressed countries are serving financial interests rather than the people. They cause a serious development deficit. The numbers are striking. Data from UNCTAD, the United Nations Committee for Trade and Development, shows that more than 54 countries spend more than 10% of their tax revenues on interest payments on debts. The average interest burden as a share of tax revenues for developing nations increased by more than 50% with respect to 2015, and 3.3 billion people live in countries that spend more on debt servicing than on health, education, and development. And 2.1 billion people live in countries that spend more on debt service than with the education with such experiences of debt servicing. These countries are unable to make investments necessary for true development, true education, true health care, and environmental concern, and a green transition if they wanted to. This is certainly not a path to equitable global human and social development. It's so very easy to discern and to see. The current situation then is one more example of a well-known asymmetry in the global financial market. Capital flows are pro-cyclical for developing economies and counter-cyclical for advanced economies. This means that capital flows from advanced economies to developing countries in good global times. But the flow turns around, reverts when there are negative global shocks and trends. Therefore, in a situation of zero interest rate in advanced economies, private capital managers search for yields elsewhere and provide financing at high interest rates, which with short-term maturities to less developed countries, whose governments, unfortunately, are always eager to borrow. Those flows, however, do not facilitate greater pro-development investment. For that to take place, they would need to be more stable, their capital cheaper, and with longer maturities. And so, for example, investment in education eventually results in higher economic productivity, but it takes a longer time, more than a decade, a time longer than the creditors and the capital givers are ready to settle. Another scenario is this. In the 2022, so shortly after the COVID time, capital began flowing out of low and middle income countries. This was capital which was financed to a larger extent by international financial institutions who wanted to increase their lending to these distressed countries to finance development, anti-poverty programs, and macroeconomic stabilization. Regrettably, however, these funds were used by these low-income countries to service bailout plans for creditors and all whom they owed and whose monies they needed to pay back. So this essentially means that taxpayers of the world are bailing out private financiers and not actually promoting development and growth in the countries which need such growth and development. And this is a highly regressive and anti-development policy which some such financial situations create. So the situation, the scenarios of the indebtedness of countries and governments in the global south are certainly varied and diverse. But the underlying and the recurrent question is, to what extent can the existing and prevailing systems and structures of borrowing and lending help deal with the debt, development, and environment crisis? The threats need to be settled for a lot of poor income developing countries. Service debt, promote development, and at the same time protect the environment. The current situation makes this very difficult for a lot of countries, and that is why we need to look for some solutions. So how can the current structure of lending, borrowing, and payment help not only to maximize gain and returns of investors and creditors, but also make these returns and gains optimal? Optimal in the sense that they help to achieve the SDGs and a human dignity and a human development narrative, promoting integral growth and promoting integral ecology, and hope for solutions to the debt, development, and environment crisis. If we're able to put all of this together, we would have achieved our goal. The international financial agencies then should care for the sustainable development of countries and should ensure that they are not subjected to oppressive lending system, which, far from promoting progress, subjects people to mechanisms which generate greater poverty, exclusion, and dependence. And so, in this situation, what can be done? Rather than just the onset of the pandemic, the World Bank indicated a way out. The World Bank at the onset of the pandemic, urged G20 countries to establish a debt service suspension initiative to help provide temporary relief to low and middle income countries, so as to free up resources for fighting the pandemic and to safeguarding the lives and the livelihood of the vulnerable. And this was extended from 2020 to actually 2021 and the beginning of 2022. And therefore, last June, at the meeting of the G7 in Puglia in Italy, a similar call was made, a call for a dialogue on debt justice and its impact on people and communities. A call on Italy-African states consultation that sought to challenge corruption and to effect debt justice. An African Climate Resilience Summit that proposes a new financial architecture which is responsive to Africa's needs, including debt restructuring and relief and the development of a new global climate finance charter. And the application of UNCTAD's principles for promoting responsible sovereign lending and borrowing, as well as its roadmap and guide on sovereign debt workouts. It also promoted or suggested enforcing debt sustainability through the public budget transparency and responsible borrowing and lending on the part of creditors and on the part of debtors. And finally, this meeting of G7 sought to enkindle the conversation on the links between debt relief and ecological debt. Something that has been happening at the COPs for the past 10 years. When in 2015, the cyclical ladder to sea came out and we took it to Paris COP21, this conversation already stalled there achievement the attainment of any consensus on the position. So relating the two, debt relief and ecological debt, is something that even Pope Francis now strongly talks about. And so, in the upcoming celebration of the Jubilee year 2025, Pope Francis takes up this relationship between debt relief and ecological debt and has this to say. Another heartfelt appeal that I would make in light of the coming Jubilee is directed to the more affluent nations. I ask that they acknowledge the gravity of so many of their past decisions and determine to forgive the debts of countries that will never be able to repay them. More than a question of generosity, this is also a matter of justice. It is made all the more serious today by a new form of injustice, which we increasingly recognize as the ecological debt, which exists between the global north and the global south, and which invites the global north to recognize and in the light of that, condone, if not completely forgive, the debts of southern countries of the global south. And so, as sacred scripture teaches, the earth is the Lord's, and all of us dwell on it as aliens and tenants. If we really wish to repair a part to peace in our world, let us commit ourselves to remedying the remote causes of injustice, settling unjust and unpayable debts, and feeding the hungry. And so ultimately, and by way of concluding, I'd like to recall the proposal made by Pope John Paul II, echoed and reformulated by Pope Benedict XVI, of getting creative with charity, walking the path of charity that corresponds to the place and the role in society that we have, and which would only make us, in the words of Pope Francis, pilgrims of hope, in the sense that so doing will bring hope to the very many indebted, the very many distressed and oppressed in society. And so with this, and with our eyes raised now to the great Jubilee year coming up in 2025, which invites all of us to be pilgrims of hope, we just want to hope that since hope in Scripture is the fruit of love and sustained by love, we hope and pray that the creative charity which the popes have called for will stimulate all to seek and endeavor to practice charity that corresponds to their positions and their roles in society, and make this undergird the sense of justice which needs to be exercised on the part of all, and so help relieve the poor and indebted countries of their indebtedness. So with these words, I want to thank you for your kind attention, and then look forward to subsequent conversations. Thank you.
Thank you all. In the last part of our evening, we have a lightning round panel. And so we would like to invite up for the panel various folks, but also we want to acknowledge some of the people that are here with us. Sylvia, are you here? We're going to ask different groups. So tonight we want to really honor and acknowledge our grassroots across the United States. And JubileeUSA, our board co-chair, and I are going to invite people up for the panel. The first group that we'd like to invite up is the Jubilee Ecumenical Coalition of Puerto Rico. Reverend Heriberto, please come up. Great.
I'd like to call up the Jubilee New York Coalition, please.
And so Matt, I know that Ruth had to leave to get on the train, so one of our own private grassroots efforts. We'd like to invite up Amani Countess, Marie Dennis, and Father Seamus Finn. If you would come up. We have three of our founding members here with us tonight that we'd like to acknowledge, and Amani and Marie will be on the panel. So. Amanda Marie will, please join us on the panel. We'd like to invite up, Reverend Bill Harmon, Reverend Steve Herder, and Reverend Caleb Lyons, who have come out from California as we, acknowledge one of our longest and most vibrant coalitions for Jubilee in the United States. And that is Jubilee Southern California, which has continued to grow as a powerful movement. And then Reverend Caleb will be taking the panel, and Sylvia.
All right, I would like to invite up AFL-CIO and the labor movement.
So Laura Gutierrez, International Coordinator, and Damon Silvers, please come on up. Laura, please take the panel. But I know folks, we're going to invite just brief 3-minute interventions from each of our panelists to speak about both the history as we celebrate 25 years of the Jubilee movement, and now as this becomes one of our kickoffs in the United States for Jubilee 2025 and 5 years of campaigns. So we're incredibly excited to have with us tonight Reverend Heriberto, Reverend Caleb, Laura, Marie, and Amani. And each panelist is going to speak a little bit from their perspective on the history of the movement, as well as speaking very specifically about the launch across the United States for Jubilee 2025, and as we organize for the G20 meetings to be hosted by the U.S. government. So I'd like to invite Amani to begin with a few comments. Amani is one of our founders, and we're so grateful to have you here with us tonight.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. And when Aldo extended the invitation on your behalf, he said we had 4 minutes. And so I'm really glad that I wrote down what I wanted to share, because that'll discipline me. One of the realities is that with the gray hair, the filters decrease and the scorings, right? So, as Eric indicated, my name is Imani Countess, and I direct the U.S. Africa Bridge Building Project. It's a small volunteer initiative that's focused on economic equality and global tax justice. And over the past 25 years, I've had the privilege of working with JubileeUSA within Jubilee's wide orbit as a supporter, a network council member, an ally, and I hope a friend. First and foremost, though, I'm an Africanist. For 40 years, I've worked in various capacities supporting African efforts for self-determination, national liberation, and economic equality. And from the 1980s to the mid-1990s, I was part of the global anti-apartheid movement. On April 16th in 1990, I was one of 70,000 people in Wembley Stadium in London, celebrating the release of Nelson Mandela and the beginning of the end of political apartheid. Sitting in Wembley, I was overwhelmed, and I still get overwhelmed by that memory, because I felt so privileged to be part of a global initiative that showed the powers of people working together for a common good, not for salary, not for prestige, certainly, again, not for salary. But I felt like really a sense of awe and humility in the knowledge that I, with others around the globe, had done the right thing at the right time to support a change that impacted the millions of people in the 15 nations of Southern Africa, from Angola to Mozambique, from Lusaka to South Africa. How often do we have an opportunity to join hands with people from all over the world to work together towards overcoming a wrong? And how often do we win? So I continued Africa-focused work, just thinking, that I was so happy, so blessed to have been a part of a global social movement, a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. I was aware of Jubilee. One of the first coordinators was a dear friend, Carol Collins, someone also with a deep history in Africa-related social and economic justice. And around 2000, I was hired to work for the American Friends Service Committee, one of the historic peace churches here in the United States. And I was I was hired to direct a US Africa initiative at AFSC. And part of that initiative involved identifying a global campaign that we could sign on to and endorse. We knew that AFSC, and in particular the Africa Initiative constituency, had very significant possibilities. We knew that AFSC could be effective in influencing US policy. We had, through our work over a couple of years, been really successful in educating people about issues of concern to Africa and prompting them to follow issues more closely than before. The majority of our participants that engaged in our activities carried out action items. Most of them had a very high level of education, they're college educated, 50% of them were over 50. 30% of the folks who came to our activities who had not been very active on Africa became more active. So we had a 30% rate of increasing activity. And we knew that because we surveyed, we used research. One of the things that our constituency said, when we looked at them and we talked to them about the kinds of campaigns, they said, well, abstract concerns like debt forgiveness, we just didn't really resonate. But our internal team, both in the US and Africa, determined that we really needed to focus on debt. And so that meant deepening our strategic partnership with Jubilee. And within that partnership, we determined that it was really important for us to build a campaign that focused very frankly on the constituencies where Jubilee was weak. That meant focusing, and that also meant focusing our attention on the areas where we, AFSC, were weak. Mainly young people and people of color. And that's what we did. We invested in outreach, we invested in relational organizing, we invested in research and evaluation, and by 2003, we were able to launch our Life Over Debt campaign, and I just want to, right? We launched this campaign, we had tons of educational material and collaterals. We engaged just about every AFSC office across the country. We implemented educational tours, training institutes. We had annual advocacy days with Jubilee and so on. By the end of that period, which could have led us up to the 2008 Jubilee, G8 meeting. Again, there I was, just considering the fact that I had been just so blessed to be part of yet another social movement was composed of people committed to change and a campaign and initiative that won victories. Right now, as we're looking at 2025, there is an opportunity, as the Cardinal has said, for a greater responsiveness, a new creativity. It's an opportunity for us to join with the global community that gives life to the Bantu concept of Ubuntu. I am because we are. And also to do what many faith traditions call us to do good, to seek justice, to correct oppression. And I share this story because this is what Jubilee does. And it's why it has developed into the powerhouse that it has today. Stellar leadership with vision, and as we heard earlier, voice. An understanding that power comes from people, grass tops and grassroots. An understanding of the need to engage people who are responding to the calls of faith. Comes from relational organizing, which many of us in this room do. And it's grounded in relationships with those most affected by the debt crisis, working on what is possible while always pushing towards what is equitable, fair, and just. And I'm absolutely delighted to have been a part of earlier successes, and I look forward to more.
As folks see, these paper chains were made by our grassroots networks across the country, and several times, including 2 years ago, we've used the chains to surround the International Monetary Fund and World Bank, as folks will remember. And so we're very excited about the growing grassroots action that's taking place around the United States. And in that vein, I'd like to invite Caleb, Reverend Caleb, just to make a few interventions about some of the grassroots work that is starting to be mobilized around the world for Jubilee 2025 and the 5 years of campaigns.
So the concept of Jubilee is a theological concept that necessarily has political implications, right? Because on the Great Jubilee year, what was supposed to happen is not only that debts were supposed to be forgiven, but the slaves were supposed to be set free, that even ancestral lands were supposed to be returned to their rightful owners. I mean, can you imagine something like that happen today? It is something that has great theological and political impacts. So Jubilee is a theological concept, and so is the concept of pilgrimage. A pilgrimage is when you travel somewhere and expect a transformation. And so one of the things that we're doing in Southern California, and we're hoping that other groups will do as well, is that we're going to take a pilgrimage to the G7 meeting this summer. And so we hope that that is something that will be transformational for us as we go, as we travel and experience this. We also hope it's something that is transformational as people see the faith community involved in hoping to work for a better world, a transformed world. So we hope that you all might do that as well in the places that you are, that you might consider going on pilgrimage there too, or encouraging your faith communities to be a part of that. But that is something we're planning to do as Jubilee in Southern California.
And yeah, pilgrimage in Jubilee year, I think it's very exciting. And it's very exciting that Jubilee Southern California and others across the United States are planning to go to the G7 meetings in Calgary, in Canada, and be a part of forming a human chain all the way from Calgary up to Kananaskis in the Rocky Mountains where the meetings are going to take place. I'd next like to invite Laura Gutierrez to make a few comments on behalf of the labor movement, which has been one of the biggest historical mobilizers for Jubilee at the G7, G20 International Monetary Fund.
Thanks, Eric. I find it a little daunting to follow a preacher behind a mic. But for those of you who don't know, the AFL-CIO is a federation of 60 unions, primarily in the US, everyone from auto workers to actors to even soccer players. I'm very proud of that. And the AFL-CIO has been a proud partner, of course, of Jubilee since the 1990s. This relationship has been invaluable in our work at the AFL to create good union jobs and shape a fairer and more sustainable global financial order. Our partnership with Jubilee helped us organize over 50,000 union members for actions against the WTO in 1999. and tens of thousands more to shut down the IMF and World Bank meetings in 2000. The AFL-CIO and Jubilee are unique allies in this work because we both understand that when the world's poor is suffering and burdened by unsustainable debt, all working people, no matter where in the world they are hurting and suffer. We both recognize how financial instability and social conflicts impact working families and with devastating consequences every day. And we know well that these crises will continue to persist so long as the fundamental structural issues driving inequality persist. So Jubilee and Eric and its phenomenal staff and its expansive community are working to address just that. And that's why we're so committed to this work. In recent years, the AFL-CIO and its affiliates, of course, in New York and elsewhere, have worked to reform New York state legislation and coordinate efforts around the G20, IMF, and the OECD. I want to thank you, Eric, personally, the phenomenal staff, of course, and every one of you here on what you have done on behalf of working people, not just here in the US, but around the world. And finally, we are so honored Cardinal Turkson can be with us tonight. A leader in his own right and a representative of His Holiness Pope Francis, a true friend of working people. And it's in that spirit of solidarity that I recommit the AFL-CIO to organize with JubileeUSA for Jubilee 2025 and the major campaigns on debt, trade, and workers' rights being launched over the next 5 years. Thanks so much.
I'd like to invite up Marie Dennis, one of our founders.
Thank you, Eric, and thank you all for being here tonight. I was asked to just say a few words about the early days of the Jubilee USA network in which I was involved. The human suffering and deep injustice associated with overwhelming debt and structural adjustment programs were increasingly evident in the global South in the 1980s and 1970s. I was working at that time for the Maryknoll Missioners, several are here tonight from Maryknoll, and heard from local communities where they were working, especially at that time in Latin America, about how the violence of the global economy was impacting people who were already impoverished. As early as 1980, a Maryknoll priest, Tom Burns, came to Washington to give testimony in Congress in opposition to IMF funding based on the damage that the IMF programs were doing in his parish in Lima, Peru. During the 80s and early 90s, religious groups and others in the global South, and to some extent in the North, were beginning to organize a response. The Freedom from Debt Coalition in the Philippines, the Third World Network, the Life Not Debt campaign, the Peru Peace Network programs, and many, many more. Most of us were on a very steep learning curve, trying to understand the roots of the debt crisis. Who was in debt to whom? What was the relationship between multilateral debt and bilateral debt and commercial debt, and who could make a decision that that this tremendous debt crisis could be dealt with? What was conditionality? Was conditionality always a negative, or were there ways to think about conditionality? And then what would justice look like in terms of overwhelming international debt? And I hear that echoed very much in what the Jubilee campaign has been doing for all of these years. Given the increased attention to unjust debts, the Religious Working Group on the World Bank and International Monetary was founded in the early 90s to articulate a call for transformation of the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund in the language of faith. Many of the 30 plus Religious Working Group participating organizations had significant interaction with peoples and communities in the 2/3 world of the poor, and had seen from their perspective the cost of the debt crisis. The Religious Working Group agreed to focus on unjust debt and structural adjustment programs, and to use the biblical theme of Jubilee in calling for global economic justice. We initiated an active dialogue with the international financial institutions educated the public about the issue, and organized public prayers and witnessing in different sorts, both in the Capitol, when you could still go into the rotunda and pray in the rotunda of the US Capitol. Nonviolent public actions in front of the International Monetary Fund, and on and on. In the mid-90s, the Religious Working Group on the World Bank and IMF was asked by the Jubilee campaign, then already underway in Europe, in England particularly, to bring the Jubilee 2000 campaign to the United States, which we did. And Religious Working Group participating organizations became the kind of basis of the organization, at least here in Washington. What was inspiring to me, and Aldo asked me to say a little bit about what was inspiring to me about those years, and what we might want to carry forward as we move into the future. What was particularly inspiring to me was that, to begin with, that we organized a global campaign, much as Amani was talking about, without smartphones or Zoom. That was pretty amazing, I think, when you look back on it. But two deep challenges stand out for me as really good examples of the dynamism and seriousness of the Jubilee Network, and I see that still very present. When the Religious Working Group was asked to host the Jubilee 2000 campaign in the US, we agreed on the condition that we could change the original Jubilee 2000 goal, which had been determined in Europe, in the UK, to be a one-off cancellation, one-off debt forgiveness for heavily indebted poor countries by 2000. And we said we could not agree that that was a sufficient goal, and argued successfully that Jubilee 2000, ultimately in the US, would work for a much deeper result in justice, not charity. That is, for the definitive cancellation of overwhelming debt of impoverished countries and the structural changes necessary to sustain that. It was clear that the system itself needed a radical transformation, and it still does. The second was that Jubilee 2000 was started in England, in the UK. That was where Imperator first sort of got things moving. Jubilee 2000 in the US was obviously a US-based movement. And I think that, and the task here was to address US policies in such a way that they would support the debt cancellation, whether it was multilateral or bilateral. But the experience and proposals of communities in the global South who were devastated by overwhelming debt were not always central to the demands of the international campaign. And I think that careful, respectful dialogue helped build understanding and relationships that were needed to address the unjust power dynamics in the Jubilee campaign itself. And I believe that the effort to do that in the very early years of JubileeUSA and the Jubilee 2000 campaign was extraordinarily important, and I see it still present. And then in the early days of the campaign, just to get anyone to take the debt crisis seriously was a very big challenge. I can remember meeting with then president of the World Bank, Jim Wolfenson, who listened to our plea that something be done about the overwhelming debt in the global South. And he simply said, even if we thought it was a problem, there's nothing we could do about it because of the charter of the World Bank. We're sorry. And I think that's where we started. And from there, every step of the way, I can remember a meeting in the International Monetary Fund with the team that was designing structural adjustment programs at that time. And I think we had 30 people from 30 countries who told what the conditionality was doing in their country. And when we went into the meeting, we were told specifically, we really don't talk to grassroots people. We talk to finance ministers. So we just said, well, all right, listen to these people. And I think that really changed over time. So those commitments on the part of the Jubilee campaign, I see as extremely important and formative in terms of what the campaign is trying to do now. They're really deep changes. For the past 10 years, I've been focused on nonviolence and just peace. It is immensely inspiring that the Jubilee campaign has continued to thrive, and it's tragic that it is still needed. 2 suggestions. Continue to follow the lead of the communities most seriously impacted by the debt crisis every time. And secondly, recognize, as you do, that the Jubilee is calling for nothing less than a paradigm shift to a world where right relationships between humans and with the earth have to shape international relations and the global economy. In other words, the Jubilee is calling for a paradigm shift from perpetual, direct, structural, and systemic violence to nonviolence. It is a demanding and pervasive shift, but one confirmed by the reality of the world we live in now. Well-organized, nonviolent action like that to which the Jubilee campaign has always been committed is the only way to accomplish the deep transformation that Jubilee promotes and the nonviolent relationships between humans and the rest of creation that are essential to the new world order we seek. Thank you.
That history and that reminder that Jubilee has persisted, because we don't take no for an answer. And it's a part of how we've been able to change, the social financial system, over the last 25 years. So our last speaker tonight is Reverend Heriberto Martinez, the leader of the Jubilee Ecumenical Coalition of Puerto Rico, who's going to offer a few comments on the Jubilee campaign that's launching in Puerto Rico, and Archbishop Roberto Gonzalez opens up the Holy Door on December 29th, as well as Heriberto is going to speak to what's happening with brothers and sisters across the Caribbean. Heriberto.
Thank you, Eric. It's a pleasure for me to be with all of you today. First of all, we want to thank JubileeUSA Network, its director, Eric Ricoma, and his team work for the commitment and solidarity with the Puerto Rican people. At the same time, we would like to thanks Pope Francis for proclaiming 2025 as the Jubilee year. We pray God to bless and guide this important initiative, Jubilee 2025, for the benefit of the world. Puerto Rico needs a comprehensive disaster relief plan to allow rebuilding the island infrastructure after the debt crisis, the hurricane, earthquakes was devastating the whole island. For my people, it's so important to develop a well-financed recovery program to provide the necessary tools to encourage economic activity and help my working class family to get back on their feet. Puerto Rico welcomes Jubilee GR 2025 and thanks Pope Francis for their and other organizations that are working in this holy initiative. As a society, it is necessary to design an educational project that addresses the climate crisis. At the same time, we must change the false notion of believing ourselves to be the owner of the creation. It is a call to ecological conversion. I was talking before as a Christian, after that, who want to become a radical believer. With ecological conversion, we transform our worldview regarding the care. One second. Regarding the care and respect of nation. Also, we have to change the political and economic mentality toward care and good stewardship of the earth. On this topic, I quote the extraordinary words of Pope Francis, and he said, ecological debt and foreign debt are two sides of the same coin that mortgage the future. For this reason, the holy year 2025, to which we are heading, all us to open our minds and heart to be able to untighten up of the tie that struggle the present, and without forgetting that we are only custodian and steward, not the master. I invite the people of Woodward around the world to pray for the well-being of our country, of our whole country, that are suffering the pain caused by external debt crisis and climate change. May God enlighten us with wisdom, so together can be a better world for all. And as Eric said, at the end of the year, Monsignor Roberto Gonzalez is gonna launch this initiative of the year in Puerto Rico. May God help us in this commitment of faith and justice. And God bless you. Amen.
Thank our panelists tonight. And now, Toby Jazz, Jubilee USA's co-chair, is going to offer the closing prayer.
Let us all join in praying together to God, who is the source of peace and perfection, the one God of us all, the God of Abraham, Moses, Jesus, Muhammad, and the God of us all. God, bring the world's faith communities together as you have brought us here together to work for good in the world. Let the divisions amongst us dissolve so we can join our hands to help those in need. We ask God, give us strength to fight for those who are oppressed around the world. We ask that you put blessing in our work, our time, and our efforts. We thank you, God, for countless blessings in our lives. Bless our families and our country. Guide our leadership to make decisions that are for the benefit of the nation and the rest of the world. We pray for our leadership to make good decisions that impact inequality and global debt policies. God, please continue to provide us safety and security and forgive us for all of our shortcomings. And be blessed with all that is good for us. We ask that you bless Jubilee USA and its mission and all that are here today. Amen.
Thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you, Cardinal Turks, for those amazing remarks, and thanks for hanging on your seats to this exciting meeting. Excited together.